Good morning, guys. So I am not with you today. I am instead, what we're going to do is I'm going to go through the notes just like I normally would, and you're going to copy the notes down into your binder. I would show you the table of contents, but it'll just confuse you. So just so you know, you should write these notes down, and then we will place them in the binder when I get back. I know you might be missing today in history as well today. Don't worry, we'll do double today in history when I get back. So the next time you see me, I'll do the today in history for today and then for that class period as well, so that no day gets left untouched. So we're going to go through notes, and then you are going to do a brief classwork for me. This is going to be relatively short. You might get done early. If you do, that's okay. But let's go ahead and get started. So the title of the notes, which you want to write down to start with these notes, is The Enlightenment and the Great Awakening. Now, just so you know, I might move a little bit faster through these notes than I would normally in class, but you have the benefit of being able to pause this video whenever you want to and being able to copy them down. Make sure you get all of the notes down on paper. If you don't, and we do a binder check, these notes could still count on a binder check, so you want to make sure you have all of them down. Okay, so the title of the notes is The Enlightenment and Great Awakening. And for us to get started, I need us to write a thesis on the American Revolution. So remember, the thesis is our reasoning for why something took place. So if I was to ask you, why did the American Revolution take place? Your thesis could be, the colonists resisted imperial control. Now, imperial is just like the British Empire. So the colonists resisted the British Empire control because of experience with self-government, the Enlightenment, and religious movements. Now, we've already talked about the self-government piece. That was the part where New England was controlling themselves, and because of that, they enjoyed that level of control or autonomy, and when the British came in and took it over with King James, it made Massachusetts mad. That's going to create some tension. That's eventually going to become a bigger and bigger deal, and we'll talk about that later. For the Enlightenment and the religious independence piece, that's what these notes are on today. And one thing that I may want you to write out to the side with the Enlightenment and the religious independent part is neither one of these movements took place originally in the colonies. They were actually things that were going on in Great Britain and were brought over to the colonies. So some of the ideas of the revolution were not American. They were British, they were European, and the colonists took those ideas to create the revolution. So let's first start with the major idea of the Enlightenment. Now, the Enlightenment is this big period. It went on for a long time. There's lots of thinkers in the Enlightenment. But the Enlightenment is basically this idea that all problems could be solved with reason. Now, before this, people did not really try to solve a lot of problems. It's not that they were necessarily using something besides reason, although superstition was more common then. You might use superstition or spiritual beliefs to try to explain a lot of unknown phenomenon. But now all of a sudden people are going to start to use logic. What this really did is it created a much more intense desire to become intelligent. The reading levels of most people were non-existent during this time. Only about 5 to 10% of people could consider themselves literate. And so because of that, everyone was really getting a lot of their information from singular sources, and that includes religion. That's important to think about. Imagine if religion is the most important thing in your entire life, and honestly, you can't even read the Bible. You're just having to go off of what your minister is saying. And the Enlightenment is one of these things that started in Europe. All right, so there's 3 major Enlightenment thinkers, although we will talk about a 4th later on down the road. So the first is a guy named Thomas Hobbes, and Hobbes believed that humans would be controlled by absolute rulers, so kings. He basically thought that people weren't necessarily trustworthy, and because of that, they were always going to need some level of control. Now, I'm kind of just breezing through these guys' outlines. Your classwork today is going to talk more about them because honestly, knowing some of these people and what their big beliefs are is really important. Then you have John Locke, and John Locke really challenged Hobbes. He created this idea called the social contract, which stated that the person who's being ruled has to give consent to the ruler to rule them. Otherwise, they need to rebel. And honestly, the social contract, I think, has been stress tested in America over the past 2 years with COVID and some of the stuff that went on January 6th. Like, people's ability to be controlled and what that looks like is really fragile. We think of it as a really stable thing because in America, it has been pretty stable for the past couple hundred years. But honestly, just a couple of small things need to happen and this social contract really gets tested. And the ruled have to have the consent of the ruler. And then finally, the whole reason why a social contract is created is because there are these natural rights, rights that cannot be taken away. And if these rights are taken away, then, sorry, that was a yawn. I was trying to pause the video, but didn't have enough time. So if the rights are going to be taken away, then that is going to mean that you're going to have a rebellion. Now, the natural rights that John Locke came up with were life, freedom, and property. Those rights are going to be slightly changed in the Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And one of the reasons why property wasn't chosen was because a lot of people in America couldn't own property. Poor people couldn't have property. Women couldn't have property, and then non-white people couldn't have property. So they changed that more to the pursuit of happiness. Now, interestingly enough, just so you know, Thomas Jefferson's original draft kind of wanted to include more of the property statement. And we'll talk about this when we get to the Declaration of Independence. With the Declaration of Independence, the northern colonies needed the southern colonies. And because of that, they wanted to appease the southern colonies by not including the property statement in there. And then you have Montesquieu. And honestly, if you look at these three pictures, Montesquieu looks like he belongs in ancient Greece. That's kind of his whole thing. But Montesquieu wanted power to be divided amongst different branches. That would create non-absolute rulers. So we have Congress, we have the president, we have the judicial branch. And those three branches are supposed to be working independently of one another, checking the power so that we don't have any leaders get too powerful. And this is another thing that's really been stress tested recently. All right, so from this, how did these ideas influence the government? Well, first thing is old types of governments, which are monarchies. Monarchies are governments that are ruled by kings and queens, are going to be kind of seen as old. And these new types of governments that are going to be really exciting are called democracies. Democracies is where you get to choose your own rulers. So we're already seeing that a little bit in America, but in France and Great Britain, they have kings and queens. So there's this pressure to start to get rid of the kings and queens. Now, the reason why kings and queens have been around for so long was there was this link between a king and a queen and then God. Basically, they believed that there was this thing called the divine right, which is that God had established the king and queen. So if you rebelled against your king or queen, then that means that you were kind of rebelling against God. With the Enlightenment, people are going to realize that that logic doesn't really line up. People are going to start to be able to read more history, and they're going to realize, oh wait, God didn't establish you. You killed your brother, or your grandfather or great-grandfather just killed their brother. And that's how they took over. God didn't necessarily establish you. So people felt like now they could rebel against their government and not necessarily God. Now, these Enlightenment thinkers are going to have a major impact on the church as well. And kind of the person who's in the forefront of all this is a guy named Ben Franklin. So let's first just talk about how it influenced the church. So most Enlightenment thinkers were called deists. And if you're a religious person, you are probably a deist today. A deist tries to combine reason and religion to one another. Now, you can take that incredibly far. Thomas Jefferson took it as far to where anything in the Bible that he could not explain with reason, he just marked out. It's called the Jefferson Bible. You can still find it today. So all the miracles and things like that are not in the Jefferson Bible. Or you can just take it to looking at the Bible sometimes in a less literal way and more of like an allegory on certain things. So the church is going to start to move away, though, from superstition. So witches, things like that are going to become less common. Now, the person in all the center of this is a guy named Ben Franklin. And Ben Franklin, if you need to know like his first major importance, is he is going to be the bridge from Great Britain to America for a lot of these Enlightenment ideas. He is going to bring a lot of the Enlightenment ideas to the colonies. And he popularized that in a book that he wrote called The Poor Richard's Almanac. And Ben Franklin's kind of an interesting guy because he's kind of he is the original American dream story. He started off poor, he became wealthy, he used education and hard work to be able to do that. Now, there are obviously lots of examples of people who work really hard and are really smart and things like that and don't get to the heights that Ben Franklin got to. But if you're wondering where the original American dream came from, it came from Ben Franklin. All right, so with these ideas interacting with religion, there all of a sudden became this movement called the First Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening also started in Europe, and then it moved over to the British colonies. And, second, John, sorry. Religion had gotten really stale at this point. It was really, really formal. There were all these rules and structures that you had to follow. And all the preachers were preachers called Old Lights. Now, if you want to get really deep into this just really quickly, the Old Light preachers believed that almost everything was predestined. What that meant was it didn't matter how hard you worked or what you did to gain salvation from God. You either got it or you didn't. And honestly, pre-Enlightenment, a lot of things were predestined. People thought, well, I was born poor, so I'm going to die poor. I was born rich, I'm going to die rich. There was no idea that really you could do anything to impact your life. Well, the Enlightenment brings a lot of control over to people's lives. And so you have these new preachers come in and they start to appeal to people because they are saying that your individual relationship with God is what's most important. You can influence your own salvation. And if you were poor or if you were a minority and you don't have the same rights as other people, this was exciting to you because now all of a sudden you had control over an aspect of your life. You could make your life better if you really tried to. So there's two preachers. One was American and one was British. The first American preacher that's really big during this time was a guy named Jonathan Edwards. And why these preachers are so interesting is there used to be this very formal training that you had to go through to be a preacher. You had to go to Harvard or Yale or Princeton. That's why those schools were established. These guys kind of go around that and they just start to think, hey, I understand the concepts of God. I'm not going to go to a formal school. So it's almost a rebellion in a way, of a rebellion of the formalized way of education. Now, Jonathan Edwards is going to be a very well-educated guy, and he is going to actually think that New England has not really been following what their Puritan forefathers had wanted them to do. So he's going to preach basically that New England society needs to go back to a more pure version. He's like a 1700 Puritan. He thinks that people have gotten too caught up in the ideas of, society, and that the church and the state have become too merged together, and that the purity of Christianity is gone. The way that he uses this is with hell. He talks a lot about hell and basically how bad hell is going to be to try to get people to kind of convert back to their more pure ways of Christianity. The second guy is George Whitefield, and I know it's spelled Whitefield, but he pronounced it Whitefield. And we call him Touchdown Jesus because every single picture you see George Whitefield in, he has his hands up like this. He is definitely the most popular preacher during this time. He was from England, and he spoke with a ton of emotion. A lot of preachers didn't speak with emotion before George Whitefield or Jonathan Edwards because they actually felt like that was going to take away from the message. So they would talk in a very monotone voice, very boring. Whitefield used his hands a lot to talk, and he used a lot of different alliterations and a lot of different speaking styles to try to draw people in. This made him incredibly popular during this time to spread these ideas of the new lights. All right, so what are the effects of the Great Awakening? They're massive. So first is individual faith is way more important than the corporate idea. There's these new colleges that are going to form for new types of preachers. Brown and Princeton are examples of that. Yale and Harvard are the old school ones. And the colonists begin to form this unique identity, this American identity. And they're going to start to challenge authority. And the reason why they challenge authority is because these old lights were challenged by new lights. This new idea came in, and people start to have democratic thought. There's all these new types of churches. So if you get to choose God, don't you get to choose your own type of government?